In the early years of the 20th century, on the north side of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a remarkable community began to rise. This was the Greenwood district, a place that would soon earn the nickname Black Wall Street. At a time when much of America was deeply segregated and opportunities for African Americans were limited, Greenwood stood out as a symbol of resilience, ambition, and success. The streets of Greenwood were alive with energy. Black-owned businesses lined the avenues, cafes, barbershops, clothing stores, and even luxury shops that rivaled those in the city's white neighborhoods. There were professional offices for doctors, lawyers, and entrepreneurs who had built reputations not only within their own community but also across Tulsa. The district had its own schools, churches, and newspapers, providing residents with education, spiritual guidance, and a strong voice in the world. Entertainment and culture flourished as well. Greenwood's theaters brought joy to families and young dreamers, while music flowed from clubs where jazz and blues echoed into the night. It was more than just a neighborhood, it was a thriving ecosystem of progress, a beacon of what was possible despite the heavy shadow of discrimination that loomed over the nation. To many who lived there, Greenwood wasn't just about wealth. It was about pride, dignity, and the freedom to create a future on their own terms. Generations of families invested their lives into building a community that could stand as proof of strength in the face of hardship. Black Wall Street became a rare jewel, admired by those who visited and cherished by those who called it home. But history has shown that moments of progress often spark resentment. As Greenwood prospered, tensions in Tulsa grew, setting the stage for a tragedy that would forever change the community. Before we dive deeper into this hidden chapter of American history, take a moment to support our journey in uncovering these powerful stories. Hit the like button, share this video with others who care about history, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next episode. Together, we can bring light to the past and ensure these stories are never forgotten. In the midst of Greenwood's success, shadows were quietly forming beyond its borders. While the district stood as a beacon of prosperity and independence, not everyone looked upon its achievements with admiration. Many outside the community carried a growing unease, a deep resentment fueled by a society that had been divided along rigid lines of race. Greenwood's rise represented more than economic progress, it symbolized a challenge to the unspoken order of the time. The early 20th century in America was a period defined by segregation laws that kept communities apart. In Tulsa, as in much of the nation, daily life was shaped by invisible walls. Schools, restaurants, theaters, and even public spaces were divided, reminding people at every turn of who belonged where. These barriers were meant to limit opportunity for some while preserving privilege for others. Yet within those restrictions, Greenwood had managed to flourish. The wealth, confidence, and independence of its residents stood in stark contrast to the narrative that segregation was designed to maintain. For white communities living nearby, this success often provoked discomfort. Many had been taught to believe that prosperity was not meant to be shared equally. When they saw thriving businesses owned by black families, bustling streets filled with shoppers, and elegant homes rising in Greenwood, it stirred feelings of envy and anger. In their eyes, Greenwood was not just another neighborhood, it was a living contradiction, proof that the assumptions of the wider society were built on fragile ground. That resentment festered in small but telling ways. Rumors would spread, jokes would be whispered, and casual remarks hinted at the bitterness just beneath the surface. Newspapers of the era often reflected and reinforced these attitudes, painting distorted pictures that fueled division. Conversations in cafes or barber chairs turned to complaints about Greenwood's success, as if the community's prosperity somehow threatened their own. It wasn't only about money or status, it was about power. Greenwood represented independence, a refusal to rely on systems that had long denied equal rights. For those determined to preserve the old social order, such independence felt like defiance. The sight of young men in tailored suits, women in fine dresses, and families sending their children to school with hope for a brighter future unsettled those who believed that progress should have limits. In this climate, small sparks had the potential to ignite larger flames. Hostility did not always erupt openly at first, it lingered, waiting for a moment when fear or rumor could turn frustration into rage. Greenwood's very existence exposed the contradictions of segregation. It was a thriving community built in spite of restrictions, and that made it both remarkable and vulnerable. The success of Black Wall Street was a source of pride for its people, but it also stood as a mirror that reflected uncomfortable truths about inequality in America. For those unwilling to confront those truths, resentment became an easier response than acceptance. It was within this simmering atmosphere of division and distrust that the seeds of conflict were sown, setting the stage for events that would forever scar Tulsa's history. It was the morning of May 30, 1921, when a seemingly ordinary encounter in downtown Tulsa set into motion a chain of events that would forever alter history. A young man named Dick Rowland, well known in the Greenwood community as a hardworking teenager who shined shoes for a living, entered the Drexel building. Inside, on the top floor, was one of the few restrooms in the area designated for people of color. To reach it, he had to take the elevator. Operating that elevator was Sarah Page, a young woman working as its attendant. Their meeting that day was brief, only a moment in time, but it would be magnified by rumor, fear, and the atmosphere of racial tension that had long been simmering in Tulsa. The details of what truly happened inside that elevator remain uncertain. Some accounts suggest that Rowland may have tripped as he entered, brushing against Sarah as he tried to steady himself. Others hint at a misunderstanding or perhaps even a minor accident that frightened her. Whatever the truth, by the time the doors opened again, a story was already beginning to form. Sarah Page's startled reaction was enough for bystanders to draw their own conclusions. In an era when suspicion could quickly morph into accusation, whispers spread like wildfire. What might have been dismissed as an unfortunate mishap soon became something far larger and more sinister in the eyes of a deeply divided city. The narrative twisted as it passed from person to person, until by the end of the day, it was said that Rowland had assaulted the young woman. The idea of such an accusation carried enormous weight. For a black teenager in 1921, even the hint of wrongdoing against a white woman was enough to spark outrage. History had already shown that accusations of this kind often led to swift and brutal consequences, regardless of evidence. Rumor alone could destroy lives, and in Tulsa, where resentment toward Greenwood's prosperity was already smoldering, this story was like oil poured onto fire. By afternoon, the local newspaper had seized on the incident. Headlines suggested violence, painting Rowland as a threat before any proper investigation could take place. The sensational language inflamed the public mood, stoking fear and anger in a city where tensions were already high. What had begun as a small, private moment inside an elevator was now being broadcast as a scandal that demanded action. Meanwhile, Rowland himself was bewildered by the storm gathering around him. Arrested and taken into custody, he could only wait as his fate seemed to slip further from his own hands. For many in Greenwood, the situation was terrifyingly familiar. They knew too well that such accusations rarely ended with fairness or justice. To them, it seemed less like a legal matter and more like the prelude to something darker, the threat of mob violence. And so, what should have remained a misunderstanding or a minor dispute became the spark that ignited one of the most devastating tragedies in American history. The elevator doors closed that day, but the rumors they left behind opened a gateway to chaos, an event that would soon engulf an entire community in flames. In Tulsa during the spring of 1921, the power of the press was immense. Newspapers were the heartbeat of daily life, shaping opinions and framing events in ways that could influence entire communities. When the story of Dick Rowland and Sarah Page began to circulate, the city's local papers did not hesitate to seize upon it. Rather than present the facts with caution, they leaned into sensationalism, amplifying rumor into something that sounded like undeniable truth. Bold headlines appeared in print, written in language designed to grab attention and stir emotion. These weren't careful words, nor were they measured reflections of an ongoing investigation. Instead, they were crafted to shock, to ignite, and to sell. The story of a young shoe shiner and an elevator operator was transformed into a tale of danger, dripping with suggestion and menace. Readers who unfolded the paper that day were confronted not with nuance but with a narrative already steeped in fear. Such reporting did more than inform, it set the tone for how the city would respond. Each headline was a spark, landing on the dry kindling of long-standing resentment and racial tension. For those already uneasy about Greenwood's prosperity, the articles seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. For others, they provided justification to act on prejudices that had been simmering quietly beneath the surface. The press had, in effect, handed a weapon to the crowd, the story itself. By evening, the rumors that had begun as whispers were now stamped with the authority of ink and paper. Conversations in shops, street corners, and barber chairs all carried the same weight. Did you read what the paper said? In a society where printed words were trusted more than personal testimony, the newspaper's voice became the voice of the city. Fear, once confined to speculation, was now broadcast as fact. The emotional charge of those headlines did not remain abstract. In a city already divided, they became marching orders for those inclined to violence. Crowds began to gather, stirred not by evidence but by outrage carefully cultivated by the press. The distance between words and action collapsed quickly, as if the ink itself had demanded a response. It is difficult to overstate how powerful that influence was. A single article could tip the balance between calm and chaos. In Tulsa, the press did not just report the story, it became part of the story, accelerating the descent into violence. What might have been an incident confined to police records was magnified until it threatened the very existence of a thriving community. For Greenwood, the consequences were devastating. While its residents braced for what might come, they knew that public opinion had already been turned against them. The battle for truth had been lost before it even began, drowned out by the clamor of headlines that had chosen sensation over responsibility. In that moment, the press was not a neutral observer but a driving force, shaping the narrative that would justify one of the darkest episodes in American history. The ink dried on the page, but the fear it spread seeped into the city's streets, setting the stage for the violence that followed. As dusk settled over Tulsa on May 31, 1921, tension gripped the city like a storm on the horizon. Word had spread quickly that Dick Rowland, the young shoe shiner accused in the elevator incident, was being held at the county courthouse. The whispers of the day had grown louder, carrying a chilling prediction: a mob might soon come for him. For the people of Greenwood, the threat was not an abstraction. They had seen what happened in other towns when accusations like this spiraled out of control. Lynchings were a brutal reality of the era, and few believed that the law alone would keep Rowland safe. As the evening deepened, a decision was made within Greenwood. A group of men, many of them veterans who had returned from the battlefields of Europe just a few years earlier, resolved to act. These were men who had worn the uniform of their country, who had fought for freedom abroad and returned with the hope of equality at home. They carried with them not only military training but also a deep sense of responsibility to protect their community. If Rowland was in danger, they would not stand by and watch history repeat itself. They gathered their weapons, not out of a thirst for violence but out of necessity. For them, it was a grim duty, to ensure that justice would not be stolen in the dark of night. Moving together through the streets, they made their way toward the courthouse, determined to stand as a line between Rowland and those who sought harm. By the time they arrived, a crowd had already formed. White residents of Tulsa, agitated by sensational newspaper reports and fueled by anger, had begun to gather in large numbers. Many were armed, their intentions clear in the way they gripped their rifles and pistols. The courthouse, meant to be a place of law and order, had become the center of a dangerous standoff. The sight of armed black men arriving in formation sent a ripple through the crowd. To some, it was seen as defiance, to others, it was confirmation of fears stoked by rumor and prejudice. Voices rose, insults were hurled, and the space between the two groups seemed to shrink with every passing second. Inside the courthouse, Rowland remained locked away, unaware of how close chaos was to erupting outside his cell. For a moment, there was still hope that calm might prevail. Leaders from Greenwood tried to reason with the crowd, explaining that they had come only to ensure Rowland's safety, nothing more. But the atmosphere was too charged. Every gesture, every word, was misinterpreted. As more armed men flooded the area, the tension snapped like a brittle rope. Accounts differ on who fired the first shot, but once the gunfire began, there was no turning back. The crack of rifles shattered the night, sending people scrambling for cover. In an instant, the courthouse square became a battleground, and what had been intended as a protective mission spiraled into open conflict. That confrontation marked the point of no return. The armed standoff lit the fuse that would explode into a catastrophe far beyond the courthouse steps. Greenwood's defenders had set out to protect one young man from a mob, but instead, they found themselves facing the full weight of a city's hostility. The first shots fired in front of the courthouse would soon echo across Tulsa, igniting a wave of destruction that no one could contain. The night of May 31, 1921, bled into chaos. What had begun as a tense standoff at the courthouse spilled over into the streets of Tulsa, and soon the fury of the mob turned its eyes toward Greenwood. The district that had once pulsed with life, its avenues filled with shops, churches, and laughter, suddenly became the target of destruction on a scale few could have imagined. At first, it began with scattered attacks. Small groups moved along the borders of the neighborhood, breaking windows, setting fires, and firing shots into the night. But by dawn, the violence had swelled into something organized and overwhelming. Waves of armed men poured into Greenwood, carrying torches and rifles, determined not simply to punish but to erase. Homes that had been built with years of savings and sacrifice were reduced to ash within minutes. Wooden walls crackled in the flames, collapsing as families fled in desperation. Business after business was ransacked, shelves overturned, registers smashed, and then set ablaze. The proud heart of Greenwood's economy, the banks, the shops, the theaters, was gutted, its achievements consumed by fire. Even churches, sacred spaces that had long been the backbone of the community, were not spared. Their stained glass windows shattered, pews overturned, sanctuaries engulfed in smoke. The air filled with the sounds of terror, the cries of families trying to escape, the roar of fire devouring entire blocks, and the relentless gunfire that echoed through the streets. Black residents, unprepared for the scale of the assault, scrambled to protect their loved ones. Some resisted as best they could, but they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Many had no choice but to run, carrying only what they could hold, as the neighborhood they called home disappeared behind them in flames. By the morning of June 1, Greenwood no longer resembled the thriving community it had been only a day before. Smoke rose high into the sky, visible for miles, as block after block lay in ruins. What had taken years to build was destroyed in hours. The destruction was not random, it was systematic, aimed at dismantling not just buildings but the very spirit of progress that Greenwood represented. For survivors, the sight was almost impossible to comprehend. Streets once filled with music and commerce were now blackened with ash and rubble. Families who had celebrated milestones in their homes stood staring at empty foundations. Entrepreneurs who had poured their lives into building successful businesses watched their dreams crumble into dust. The assault on Greenwood was more than physical devastation, it was a deliberate attempt to erase the accomplishments of an entire community. The rioters sought to send a message, that success, dignity, and independence could be taken away in an instant. And yet, even in the face of such devastation, the spirit of Greenwood's people endured. Though their neighborhood had been reduced to ruins, their determination to remember, rebuild, and bear witness to the truth would not be extinguished. Those 2 days in late May and early June were a turning point. Greenwood's story was no longer only about prosperity, it had become a story of survival against overwhelming destruction, a story that continues to echo through history. As the violence raged across Greenwood, an unexpected and terrifying element entered the scene, one that would forever set this tragedy apart from so many others. Survivors would later recall looking up to the sky, only to see the hum of private planes circling overhead. At first, many thought they were carrying observers, curious onlookers who had come to watch the city burn from above. But soon it became clear that these machines were not simply witnesses. They were part of the assault. Eyewitnesses described small aircraft swooping low over the district, their engines buzzing like angry hornets above the chaos. From their bellies, objects fell, some claimed they were incendiaries, others bundles that ignited upon impact. Fires, already raging across Greenwood streets, began to spread faster, fueled by the strange and terrible rain from the sky. Homes that might have been spared were suddenly engulfed, and businesses that had only just caught fire were consumed in towering flames. Imagine the horror of standing in your yard, clutching your children, watching not only mobs tearing through the streets but also flames falling from above. For the people of Greenwood, there was nowhere safe to run. The ground itself was dangerous, and now the sky had turned hostile as well. Families who had hidden in their attics or cellars found themselves trapped as their houses ignited from both directions. The air grew thick with smoke, choking those who fled, blinding them as they stumbled through streets that had become infernos. The use of planes was not only destructive, it was symbolic. It showed that the attack was not a random outbreak of violence but a coordinated effort to utterly devastate Greenwood. Fire had always been a weapon of terror, but from the skies, it became unstoppable. No bucket brigades could compete with flames ignited across multiple blocks in mere moments. Survivors recalled the planes with disbelief, as if the nightmare could not possibly be real. Some spoke of machine gun fire raining down, while others remembered the distinct thud of explosives hitting rooftops. Whatever the exact details, one fact remained: the skies above Tulsa, meant to represent freedom and possibility, had been turned into another front in the destruction of an entire community. When the smoke finally began to clear, much of Greenwood lay in ruin. Block after block bore the marks of fire too intense to have spread naturally, too widespread to be explained by chance. The planes had accelerated the devastation, ensuring that Greenwood would not simply be damaged but nearly erased. For decades, the memory of the aerial assault was dismissed, buried beneath silence and denial. Yet those who lived through it carried the images in their minds: the buzzing of engines overhead, the falling sparks that turned their homes to ash, the realization that even the heavens had been turned against them. This element of the tragedy makes Greenwood's story stand out in the history of racial violence. It was not only a mob on the ground that destroyed a neighborhood, it was also an attack from the skies, a chilling reminder of how far hatred could go when fueled by fear and resentment. And for the survivors, the sound of those planes would remain etched in memory, a haunting echo of the day when fire rained from above. When the fires finally died down and the mobs dispersed, what remained of Greenwood was little more than smoldering ruins. In the silence that followed, the true scale of the tragedy began to emerge. Families searched through the ashes of what had once been their homes, calling out for loved ones who never returned. The streets that only days earlier had been alive with commerce and music now resembled a battlefield, littered with debris and the weight of unimaginable loss. The number of lives taken during those 2 days was staggering. Eyewitnesses spoke of bodies lying in the streets, of hurried burials, and of wagons carrying the dead away under cover of night. Some families never found those they had lost, their loved ones vanishing into unmarked graves or mass burial sites. Estimates of the dead reached into the hundreds, yet official records told a very different story. The city's leaders and institutions downplayed the truth, reporting far fewer deaths than survivors knew to be real. For decades, the exact toll of the massacre remained clouded in secrecy, hidden behind silence and denial. Beyond the lives lost, the human cost stretched even further. Thousands of residents found themselves suddenly without homes, their possessions reduced to cinders. Families who had worked tirelessly to build stability and prosperity awoke to find everything gone. Mothers clutched their children, wondering where they would sleep. Fathers stared at the ruins of businesses they had built from nothing, now destroyed in hours. The thriving district that had once stood as a monument to resilience was reduced to a landscape of homelessness and despair. Temporary camps sprang up across Tulsa as displaced families sought refuge. Churches outside Greenwood opened their doors, schools were transformed into makeshift shelters, and relief efforts tried to provide food and clothing. Yet no amount of charity could mask the injustice. These were not victims of a natural disaster, they were victims of deliberate destruction, and the burden of rebuilding was placed squarely on their shoulders. What made the tragedy even more painful was the silence that followed. Rather than acknowledge the devastation, officials worked to suppress the truth. Records were incomplete or hidden, newspapers avoided revisiting the story, and for generations the massacre was barely mentioned in classrooms or history books. Survivors carried their memories quietly, often reluctant to speak for fear of retaliation or disbelief. The erasure was almost as cruel as the violence itself, turning a community's suffering into a forgotten shadow. Still, the people of Greenwood endured. Those who had lost everything began the difficult task of starting over, rebuilding homes and businesses brick by brick. Their determination stood in defiance of both the violence that had sought to erase them and the silence that followed. Yet the weight of loss never faded. Each new wall laid in Greenwood was a reminder of what had been taken, and each life rebuilt carried the memory of those who never had the chance. The massacre's legacy is not just one of destruction, it is also a story of survival. Though the official numbers were suppressed and the truth buried for decades, the voices of survivors and their descendants refused to disappear. Their memories preserved the reality of what happened, ensuring that the full scope of the tragedy would eventually come to light. And with that truth came a reminder, that behind every statistic were real families, real dreams, and real lives cut short in the ashes of Greenwood. As the violence consumed Greenwood, many of its residents looked desperately toward the authorities for protection. Surely, they thought, those sworn to uphold the law would intervene to stop the bloodshed. But what unfolded shattered that expectation. Instead of safeguarding the lives and property of the district's families, the very institutions meant to provide order either stood idle or, far worse, became participants in the devastation. Accounts from survivors paint a harrowing picture. Black families who rushed to policemen for safety were met not with shelter but with indifference. Officers were seen directing armed mobs rather than dispersing them. Some even deputized white civilians, handing out weapons and badges that became licenses for violence. This infusion of official power emboldened the attackers, transforming what might have been contained chaos into a full-scale onslaught. It was as though the machinery of the city had turned against one of its own communities, sanctioning destruction under the guise of law and order. In some instances, authorities actively joined the mob. Reports surfaced of police officers firing weapons into Greenwood, not at rioters but at residents defending their homes. Rather than arrest those who set fires, they arrested black men trying to protect their families. Truckloads of armed white men moved freely through Tulsa streets, often with police escorts. To the survivors, it was unmistakable, those who should have been guardians had chosen a side, and it was not theirs. For Greenwood's people, this betrayal cut deeper than the flames devouring their businesses or the bullets shattering their homes. It revealed that their lives were valued less by the system meant to serve them. They were not only under attack by mobs but also abandoned by those sworn to shield them from harm. The sense of isolation was crushing. Women and children huddled in basements or fled into the countryside, knowing no help would come. Men who took up arms to defend their families faced not just rioters but an alliance of lawmen and civilians aligned against them. The consequences of this failure echoed long after the fires went out. When survivors attempted to file insurance claims for their destroyed property, many were denied on the grounds that the violence had been labeled a riot. The same authorities who had failed to protect them now worked to deny them compensation, deepening the wound. The law had not only turned its back on Greenwood in the moment of crisis but also in the difficult aftermath of rebuilding. What made the betrayal even more haunting was the silence that followed. Official reports downplayed the involvement of police and local officials, casting the massacre as a spontaneous eruption of violence rather than a coordinated assault abetted by those in power. For decades, this narrative buried the truth, leaving survivors to carry the weight of both trauma and injustice. Yet within Greenwood's families, stories persisted. Grandparents told grandchildren how the very people trusted to keep order had turned away or, worse, joined the destruction. These accounts, passed quietly from one generation to the next, became a counter-history, preserving the reality that official records sought to erase. The massacre was not just an act of mob violence, it was a collapse of trust in institutions. It revealed how fragile justice could be when prejudice corrupted authority. And though Greenwood's people rebuilt with remarkable resilience, they never forgot the bitter truth of that night, that the greatest danger did not only come from the mobs but from the betrayal of those who had the power to stop them. For generations, the story of Greenwood's destruction was hidden in the shadows, absent from classrooms and history books. Survivors carried the memories in silence, their voices muffled by a society that chose not to confront the painful truth. Families who had witnessed the fires, the chaos, and the loss of loved ones often spoke only in whispers, sharing fragments of the past within their own homes. It was as though an entire community's suffering had been locked away, denied the dignity of acknowledgement. But history has a way of resurfacing, no matter how deeply it is buried. In recent decades, researchers, descendants, and community leaders have worked tirelessly to uncover the full scope of what happened in Tulsa. Their determination ensured that the silence could not last forever. Stories of loss, but also of survival, began to find their way into documentaries, classrooms, and public memorials. What was once nearly erased is now recognized as one of the darkest, most devastating racial attacks in the nation's past. Yet this story is not only about destruction, it is also about resilience. In the face of unimaginable hardship, Greenwood's people rebuilt, brick by brick, refusing to allow the hatred that had tried to erase them to succeed. Their determination to rise again stands as a powerful testament to the human spirit. It reminds us that even when confronted with violence and injustice, communities can endure, preserve their dignity, and pass on their legacy to future generations. Greenwood became more than a district in Tulsa, it became a symbol of both profound injustice and extraordinary resilience. Remembering this chapter of history is vital, not only to honor those who suffered and lost so much but also to ensure that such silence and denial never happen again. The massacre is a warning about what unchecked hatred can do, but it is also an enduring story of courage, perseverance, and the unbreakable will to survive. As we reflect on Greenwood's legacy today, we do more than remember tragedy, we celebrate the strength of a community that refused to disappear. And in sharing these stories, we keep their voices alive, ensuring that they continue to teach and inspire. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others so the lessons of Greenwood will not be forgotten. Thank you for being here, and may you carry these memories with you into tomorrow. Wishing you all a peaceful night, sleep well and take care.